diverse properties of the scorned and condemned marijuana plant could provide sufficient clothing, oil, medicine, fuel, food, and shelter for all the peoples of the world if completely legalized and commercialized, and that hemp might prove to be the means of saving the planet, that is us, from acid rain, global warming, and the depletion of our precious forests and fossil fuels. That sounds like a pretty tall order for a weed.
Yeah, for a weed. But now they've got it down to one roach or one this. They can take your house, your property, your car. Not if you kill somebody. Not if you're drunk and you run over them. But if you're smoking a joint on the side of in your car, or they can take your car away. But if you got a bottle in your car and you're drunk, they don't take your car away. They just impound it for the night until you can pick it up.
But now, with Philippine and East Indian sources of hemp in the hands of the Japanese, and shipment of jute from India curtailed, American hemp must meet the needs of our Army and Navy, as well as of our industries. In 1942, patriotic farmers, at the government's request, planted 36,000 acres of seed hemp, an increase of several thousand percent. The goal for 1943 is 50,000 acres of seed hemp.
Harry Anslinger by that time knew that marijuana no longer caused violence. He thought it caused pacifism. After selling it to Congress to make it criminal because it was hatchet murders and accidents and violence, he sold it 10 years later because the communists would give it to our boys to sap our will to fight. And they passed the law, the exact opposite reasoning 10 years later, that they outlawed it in the first place. First for violence, and then because it was too pacifistic. Wow, what a government that can think on its feet like that.
The reasons for the legalization of marijuana and hemp, and also sections from a government documentary from the 40s in which they say that we should have hemp for victory in World War II. You'll see this right now on Alternative Views.
Hello, welcome to Alternative Views. Our guest today is Jack Harar, who is the author of The Emperor Wears No Clothes, which is subtitled The Authoritative Historical Record of the Cannabis Plant, Hemp Prohibition, and How Marijuana Can Still Save the World. So today we're going to talk to Jack about some plants that were prohibited, that are now illegal, and Jack's going to tell you why these plants should be made legal for your health, for the well-being of the economy, and to help solve certain social and psychological problems. So Jack, welcome to Alternative Views.
I can tell you all that.
The preface to your book is written by George Clayton Johnson, who's written several Twilight Zone episodes, Logan's Run, the movie, Star Trek, Ocean's 11. And he says here in the preface, the premise of the book, The Emperor Wears No Clothes, is fanciful in the extreme, that the diverse properties of the scorned and condemned marijuana plant could provide sufficient clothing, oil, medicine, fuel, food, and shelter for all the peoples of the world if completely legalized and commercialized, and that hemp might prove to be the means of saving the planet, that is us, from acid rain, global warming, and the depletion of our precious forests and fossil fuels. That sounds like a pretty tall order for a weed.
Yeah, for a weed. But nothing else grows like a weed, they say. Well, it's a surprise to me, too.
How is this possible? How is it?
Well, it was always possible. Hemp is the primary plant that grows on our Earth on a planet-wide, climate-wide, soil-wide basis, latitude-wide basis. Nothing else comes close to hemp on sustainable, renewable annual resource of plant life and cellulose. 1 acre of hemp over the same 20-year period produces 4 times the amount of cellulose as trees. So 1 acre of marijuana equals 4 acres of trees. For fiber, this jacket I'm wearing is made out of cannabis. Almost everything on this museum here either is replicas or is cannabis. Cannabis rugs made from cannabis. They all last. They're 4 times softer, 4 times longer, more water absorbent, 3 times the tensile strength, 26 times longer lasting, doesn't need any pests or herbicides, and is sustainable on earth, doesn't poison or deplete the soil. It's an incredible plant.
Soil that will grow good corn will usually grow hemp. Hemp is not hard on the soil. In Kentucky, it has been grown for several years on the same ground, though this practice is not recommended. A dense and shady crop, hemp tends to choke out weeds.
Here we have a plant that mankind used as its #1 plant for paper, fiber, and fuel up until about the 1700s, and for paper and fiber till the middle of the last century. And this plant already can do the industrial strength necessary to replace fossil fuels and to stop the cutting down of trees for paper. Only cannabis can make all the paper. In fact, once did. Paper was made, as you know, from rags, and the predominant rag on earth was hemp until the middle of the last century. The sails, canvas sails, like on the ships, were cannabis sails. Canvas was the Dutch pronunciation of cannabis. So canvas-covered wagons were cannabis-covered wagons. And the paper, then the paper in the books here, and these books are all 200 years old. It was all made out of hemp, and maybe hemp and flax, but they didn't say, that's flax, that's hemp. We won't mix the two. They just mixed them in the rags, and the predominant rag was hemp. Our ancestors were much too thrifty to ever throw anything away. So whenever they had a rag, a diaper, and they lasted forever when you made it out of hemp, 26 times longer than cotton. And when they finally wore out, we turned it into paper, and that was our newspapers. That's the book you're looking at 200 years later. And if it was out of wood or anything else, it had been long gone.
So Jack, hemp, it sounds like, is more American than apple pie. In fact, it sounds like it was a basic industrial commodity.
I mean, if we had ultimate amounts of time, I could read you the beginning of a book that I have here that's 90 years old, and it's printed on hemp. It's called The Reign of Law, A Tale of the Kentucky Hemp Fields, about Bible kids going to college, doing God's holiest work, working in the hemp fields to earn their living, to go to college, and it tells you all about how hemp was in Kentucky. The Anglo-Saxon farmers had scarce conquered foothold, stronghold, it says, and it goes on about this is in the 1770s, 80s. Hemp in Kentucky in 1782, early landmark in the history of the soil of the people, cultivated first for the needs of the cabin and clearing solely for twine and rope, towel and table, sheet and shirt, and by, not for cabin and clearing only, but for tow homespun, fur-clad Kentucky lawn, and then about ships and the baling of the cotton, and it goes on how it grew, and no other color existed. The wealthiest farmers grew it. It was the hardest work. They needed the strongest people. What a great thing, and that's all in the first few pages.
For centuries prior to about 1850, all the ships that sailed the western seas were rigged with hempen rope and sails. For the sailor, no less than the hangman, hemp was indispensable. A 44-gun frigate, like our cherished old Ironsides, took over 60 tons of hemp for rigging. Including an anchor cable 25 inches in circumference. The Conestoga wagons and prairie schooners of pioneer days were covered with hempen canvas. Indeed, the very word canvas comes from the Arabic word for hemp. In those days, hemp was an important crop in Kentucky and Missouri.
So this is a typical hemp field in Kentucky. Were there hemp fields all over the U.S.?
Oh, yeah.
Was this like a major
It was the number
crop?
two crop in the United States until about 1850 or 1860 after cotton. It was the most industrial. We had to start at that time, at the end of slavery, start bringing in cheaper imported fibers, or the same fiber, but from other countries, because after the end of slavery, we couldn't get cannabis cheap enough because of the labor involved. It took 300 hours to harvest and break an acre and get it ready for industrial use. In the 1930s, we invented machinery that brought that 300 hours down to 1 hour. And in the book that I have in front of you, we document Popular Mechanics, February of 1938, exactly the way it appeared, saying that marijuana will make all the dynamite, all the cellophane, all of the paper, that more than half of all things called linen were not made from flax, but indeed made from cannabis hemp, that's marijuana, or the same exact plant, and that all the paper will now be made out of marijuana. The 10,000 acres will produce as much as 40,000 acres of average pulp trees and make every grade of paper. And this is Popular Mechanics. This is not some left-wing newspaper or some nuts saying this. And this was also Mechanics Illustrated. It was also all the engineering journals of the time. Hemp was going to be this incredible, incredible product because machinery brought it down from 300 hours to harvest to 1.
There's one little drawback in this hemp scenario, and that is it's marijuana. That if you smoke it, it has certain, we say psychedelic properties in the.
Well, that was always considered a plus for the first couple thousand years,
right,
until white Southerners got hold of it. We should remember that the first country to outlaw marijuana in modern history was South Africa. And it was only outlawed in 1910, and it was only outlawed for its black people because they had used it for their religions as their holy sacrament called Daga, and all of you can look it up in your dictionary, D-A-G-G-A, which means marijuana, the flower of the hemp plant, which was the religion of the Bantus and the Hottentots, and the Zulus used it, and the Pygmies and the Bushmen used it, and the white South African could not stand the vicious insolence that these ethnic people would do to the whites when they would be under the influence of this Daga marijuana. They would step on their shadows, they would make eye contact with them, they would look at white women twice, all sorts of disgusting crimes. And they even had a lot of business connections in the South and warned New Orleans that it was happening right there in New Orleans, brought up by British Hindus that had been brought into Barbados and Jamaica into the Caribbean as cheap labor, had brought their ganja, had retaught the blacks to smoke, brought it up into New Orleans in 1910, and the Public Safety Commissioner in New Orleans said it was the most vicious drug they'd ever had. They would refuse to go to the back of the trolley. They would actually just step on people's shadows and stare them in the eye. This couldn't be around. The decent white folk weren't safe when these reefer people, Grifa people, which were kind of mulattoes, would be smoking this drug, this marijuana, that they would actually just stare right in their eye, and they refused to wear blackface, which was illegal in 1910. Black people could not appear on the stage without putting on a face and pretend to be a white person playing a black person. And when they were stoned, they would forget. I mean, we got people doing, I'm sorry for all of you guys, but for the hundreds of thousands of people in prison or on probation and parole, lost your homes, kids, you were really there because black people couldn't handle this. And Mexican Americans in Texas, if you read the state legislature here, and the insolence and the vicious insolence by Pancho Villa's army when they came up over the border, they were smoking dope. That's what the song La Cucaracha is about. And they would step on the white people's shadows. They would get off the road. They wouldn't get off the street at night at 6 o'clock. So when the white people's shadows cast long things, they had to get off the road. And that's why blacks had to be off the street at night, so they didn't actually step on a long person's shadow.
I hadn't heard this shadow story before. Is this like superstition, or is it social? This is Jim Crow law.
Yeah.
It's just like privilege. It's white.
Oh yeah, that was the way to keep people from actually getting too close to you, that they didn't. So you can't step on my shadow. And if they did, all you had to do was take them by the wrist, take them to the justice of the peace, put him on trial right then, and sentence him for 10 days for this Jim Crow violation. No lawyer, no nothing, no bail. He's 10 days for insolence, vicious insolence.
Wow.
And then they played satanic music when they were stoned. They keep talking in the newspapers in New Orleans and Harry Ansting and later on that this vicious drug, this marijuana, caused it to slow down time so much that people could hear, especially these Negroes, could hear where to put in added grace beats between the notes of written music, and they jazzed it up, and that is satanic. And if you can't follow that, I think
Sounds pretty jazzy to me, actually.
And so, I mean, we now call that jazz, but
Right.
it was satanic to the first 20 years of hysteria, even into the 40s and 50s. We were following Cab Calloway, Dizzy Gillespie, Louis Armstrong.
Charlie Parker.
They were all followed day and night by what is now the DEA, which was then the Federal Bureau of Narcotics, and they kept following around and saying these men would smoke marijuana, and they were going to bust all of them, all of the great jazz entertainers, Thelonious Monk, all of these guys, Milton Berle, Jackie Gleason, Kate Smith, all on the same night, and they were going to bust them all on the same night. We tell the story in the book, and they were going to wipe the scourge out and show it to me what it is. Of course, there was only 100,000 people smoking, not the 50 million now, but the 100,000 people, according to 15% of the murders were marijuana smokers. Now, does anybody believe that now? That would mean that marijuana smokers now would do 7.5 million murders a year.
So when was marijuana first made illegal?
1937.
So 1937, suddenly throughout the United States,
Suddenly
it
throughout the
was
United States.
outlawed. And there were films
no
like
discussion.
Reefer Madness
Yes.
and a lot of propaganda against it. How did this happen on such a national level? that
Well, William
marijuana was
Randolph
outlawed?
Hearst had coined the word marijuana from a Mexican Sonoran colloquialism for intoxicant marijuana.
Okay.
And he, instead of using the word cannabis or hemp, he kept using marijuana, killer weed. And so nobody that knew that marijuana was the same benign plant that had been our number 1 and 2 and 3 medicine in the 1800s, and now was still a very popular medicine in the 1920s and 30s especially. It was the number 1 veterinary medicine in America. And nobody knew this, and Harry Anslinger would go around the country and he would tell women's groups that if the monster Frankenstein, we have the exact quote from the newspaper, came in contact with the monster marijuana, the monster Frankenstein would die from fright. And the women go, this scourge must be stopped before it gets to your child. And I guess this was pretty heavy, illumination for the 30s. Frankenstein, marijuana, and marijuana was worse. Wow, that's pretty scary stuff.
And
they built this hysteria.
Right.
They suddenly introduced this bill on March 29th. And on April 14th, 1937, it went right to the House Ways and Means, which is the only committee that brings their bills directly to the floor without going through other committees. And they said, we're going to tax this because we can't prohibit it, but we'll put a prohibitive tax on something they had just gotten through on a Machine Gun Act. And this became the first drug ever outlawed, or the first anything outlawed, based on taxing. That's why it was called the Marijuana Tax Act. And what subsequently happened is they told everybody that this led to harder things, that people went out to heroin, basically because the same people dealt heroin that dealt marijuana as they perceived it. It just kept growing. They did it suddenly. There was no argument except the AMA and industrial companies. The AMA came out and said, hey, this is a miracle drug. We just don't know what makes it work yet. Once we know what makes it work, please don't prescribe it. We've never had a trouble with it. They lied in Congress when asked what the AMA said. The AMA said it was okay to outlaw it, that they didn't need it. The AMA had said the exact opposite. We have 100% of the hearings in Congress in the 30s in the book. And so all these things built up. It wasn't big public news, by the way. It wasn't like main newspaper. It happened just like that. It never saw the light of day. While it was being outlawed, it did not get any press. So nobody knew it was actually happening.
Jack, wasn't there any hemp lobby? If it was
Yes.
such a big industrial commodity, one would have imagined there'd be some groups that would be saying, hey, there's a use for this. Hey, there's jobs at stake. There's money to be made. It's capitalism you're attacking.
Well, these are all the statements of organizations that owned companies that process hemp. Statement of Matt Renz, representing Rem's Hemp Company, Brandon, Wisconsin. He'll tell you all the
But they weren't able to stop this. This hysteria
all
was
the
so
plastic.
great.
Here's a company,
Right.
A Hemp Co. of Danville, Illinois. All plastic will be made out of hemp if you don't outlaw it. They told them that. They don't need it. We've got petroleum.
So the petroleum lobby probably was not unhappy about this.
No, I don't think they were. But whether they actually were conspirators or whether there's some sort of need in the human race to have planetary amnesia when the government says, oh, this is against the law, that all of us automatically forget about it and don't talk it, we don't bring it up. It's like the Smithsonian. I went to the Smithsonian. I went to your own museum here at the Alamo in San Antonio the other day. There's everything in that museum that's cloth is made out of hemp. There's nothing in the Alamo. There's virtually nothing prior to 1850 except a few cotton pieces in the Smithsonian. And at the Smithsonian, I'll tell you what they told me. The Smithsonian said, when I asked them why their covered wagons and why their sailing ships and hundreds of them that they had didn't represent hemp, that they represented manila, jute, and sisal, and all the very minor fibers that together didn't amount to 10%, why didn't you have a hemp that was 80? And they said to me, when we put up hemp signs, all the children call up and they want to know if hemp is marijuana. So I said, why don't you put a little sign that hemp also contains the flower known as marijuana? She said, there's no reason for children to know this anymore.
Well, systematic
that is ethnocentricity.
Systematic ignorance is part of American education.
But this is the Smithsonian. This is what we hold up as our God museum. Yeah. What do we do? And they're saying, so I said, listen, we got to put it out there. He said, Mr. Harar, we are not a fiber museum. We just incidentally happen to mention manila and jute and sisal. We feel we've done our job. They're aware that there are fibers that come from separate plants. I said about 80% of the things in your museum, the paper, the books, the cloth, the stitching on the shoes, the newspapers of the old days of the colonial period, were all made out of cannabis. Why don't you just list them that they're hemp? That way people can have a better chance at the laws. There is no reason for children to know this anymore, Mr. Harar. Now, what kind of system is this? That kind of system is this. I have an article here from Scientific American this month on my book, and it's a great review, and then it gets to the last paragraph, and it says, Quentin Jones of the U.S. Department of Agriculture says that there are other plants that could do the various things, the various utilitarian things that hemp can do more economically. So I called Quentin Jones from Houston 2 days ago, and I said, what are those plants? Right. And he said, well, I didn't exactly quote it like that. What I said is it's going to take thousands of inspectors to be out there in the fields. When you're growing tens of thousands of acres, we're going to have thousands of inspectors out there inspecting each plant and putting a tag on so to make sure that none of those plants are over 0.003 THC like they do in France and Spain. And I said, but we're talking about millions of acres. We're talking about making all of our paper, all of our fuel possibly out of it, all sorts of fiber to re-heal the earth of where the earth is dead. He said, Mr. Harar, we're not going to let you grow as strong a marijuana as you want. It's going to have to be down below 0.003%. And so we're going to need thousands and thousands of inspectors. So why are you doing that? Why does it need to be down below? He said, you know what happens when college kids get a hold of that? What? I swear my life. This is exactly what he's telling me. He said, when college kids get hold of that, it ruins their whole life. He said, that's why we're going to have the thousands of inspectors. And you realize that we've been smoking it for 25 years in college and anybody's life? He said, there's a lot of people's lives that have been ruined about it, Mr. Harar. Only because of the laws, you know? And then you can't get into this argument. This man is in charge of narcotic plant research and development for the United States Department of Agriculture, Quentin Jones. And the problem with marijuana is it's illegal, and it has a narcotic top, and we'll need thousands of inspectors to make sure that nobody, especially you college kids, ever get your hands on this stuff. Well, we'd rather see the planet die than you get high, remember that.
Well, yeah, that brings up another question. I mean, you claim that this will solve the greenhouse
I claim that theoretically, it's the only theory I've ever seen or anybody else has seen that's worked. You outlaw fossil fuels. You stop the cutting down of trees. That is the only way to stop the greenhouse effect. There isn't another way, no matter how you try or think. I called the head man at the Department of Agriculture about 1.5 years ago to reverse the greenhouse effect. The man in charge of reversing, his name was Steve Rawlings. And if you heard the story I told last night, Steve Rawlings said you can't use it, even though he thought it was the best idea he had ever heard about reversing the greenhouse, about a plant that can make the paper, fiber, and fuel. And I first let him compare it with all the other plants. And he said that you cannot use, and he said, Mr. Harar, you aware that hemp is marijuana? I said, yes. He said, you know that marijuana is illegal, don't you? I said, yes. So you can't use it. It's a wonderful idea, but you won't be able to use it. I said, why not? He said, it's illegal, you can't use it. I said, not even to save the world? He said, not even to save the world, it's illegal. I said, wait a second. Do you know what,
It's illegal inside the world.
I said, we're talking about plants here. I mean, if this plant could do all the things we said and that you and I have speculated on the last half hour, Mr. Rawlings, why can't we use it? Mr. Harar, I just finished telling you, it's illegal.
End of story.
And you can't use something illegal to save the world. And Quentin Jones was essentially telling me the same 2 days ago.
Jack, how can hemp be used for fuel? Obviously, I can understand how it could be used for paper and fiber because it was used to serve those needs for centuries. But I have some problem imagining how hemp could solve the fuel problem. Could you explain that
Well,
a
I
little
think
more?
first of all, you have to unthink, and I think a lot of people here at Texas go to, there's a great oil school
Right.
here. First of all, the oil cracking process was developed from wood cracking. And it wasn't figured out till 40 years after they had oil that they accidentally stumbled, hey, you know, we could crack this the same way we do wood. So it's a cellulose cracking system. The venting of all the different gases that you see running around a refinery happen because they have different weights and they vent at different areas. So all you have to do with hemp is you grow it, you dry it. Just like you get John Deere's to pelletize these things. We'd send them to a hopper. They would be charcoalized, just like if you were making mesquite into charcoal. Okay, when you charcoalize it, it gives it a new burning heat quality. We replace all coal with no more sulfur, no big billion-dollar machines from General Electric and Westinghouse being made to scrub sulfur and from the air, which, by the way, does nothing for the carbon dioxide. Still stay up forever because it's from fossil fuel. But you then charcoalize this and you gasify it and you vent it just like you would. You crack it literally just like you would if it had been oil, the hemp. Or any biomass. It doesn't have to be particularly hemp, but hemp is the greatest continuous sustainable biomass, is why we use it. And then you would charcoalize it, gasify it, recondense it into methane, methanol, and then catalyze it back into gasoline. The unrecondensable gases would be mixed with water, which would be the heat for running this whole charcoalizing process, or be co-generators out. This is the systems that are taking place. This would be so efficient of a system. Here, every acre will produce a minimum of 500 to 1,000 gallons of gasoline every year. And before the other crops are in, after the other crops are out, or on marginal lands, we could send the soldiers not to Saudi Arabia, but to Nebraska and Iowa, and have them plant the marginal lands and harvest and rebuild the infrastructure of the world. I mean, it's the only way the planet's going to survive is to stop burning fossil fuels. We have 20 billion tons of carbon dioxide going up in the atmosphere that will stay up forever and ever and ever, because nothing's growing now to take it out of the ground for millions of years. It died millions of years ago. But if you burn an annual renewable, if you had a plant that could grow that big and fast all over the planet, and you burn that annual renewable, all that carbon dioxide that you put up comes out again next year when you grow it, and it breathes back oxygen, and the earth is in exact balance, and you stop the greenhouse effect. And there is no other way than to stop cutting down trees and to stop burning fossil fuels. And this plant is the most significant single piece in our armor. As ridiculous and preposterous as it sounds, $10,000, you ain't got another one.
Now, has this been tested in terms of producing fuel in the process that you described? Have people actually done this to show that it works? Yeah.
Well, any biomass will work, and we've done it with biomass. Okay, no other biomass compares with hemp, so we don't have to really worry about it. And corn is very good, but it's not sustainable. You need as much petroleum fertilizer back on as you put off, so whatever you gain on the Ferris wheel, you'll lose on the merry-go-round.
Why hasn't some third world country tried this?
Well, I don't think they realize it. For instance, China now is beginning to make huge amounts of its paper, approximately 60% of its paper, from hemp. They're using the whole outside and the inside. They're pulping the whole plant. But they are just becoming aware. Well, they never modeled or took the models off their mind about how much you could grow. Here's a plant that could grow everywhere. They never extrapolated or speculated in their mind how fast and far it could grow and then do it. And they're using it to replace trees. So that is a third world country. Romania and Hungary still use it. In France and in Spain, we grow it. Most of the cigarette paper, whether they be Morrow or Zigzag, are made out of hemp and flax combined materials to give that thin cigarette paper body, so it doesn't rip apart when it's in the high-speed machines. They can do all this right now in France, and I just left there last week, and Spain, I left there 2 weeks ago. They're growing it for just this purpose, paper. They never even thought in biomass. I mean, I talked to the director of cannabis for France, and he never, I said, you could grow tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of acres. He said that they're not going to change all those vineyards they got growing.
They like their wine as much as some people like their weed.
Yeah, they got wine all over the place. And he said, but he stopped and thought about it. I said, no, we're beginning to develop it again for textiles, he told me. But he said that they're not growing it for biomass because it never even clued on them. I don't know about the rest of the third world countries. My suspicion is that if you see the movie Hemp for Victory, you see the machinery, that's state of the art that brought it down from 300 hours to 1 hour. Third world countries are all doing this by hand.
And they don't have the machinery to make it economical yet.
No, they can't think in terms of 50 million. First of all, there's only one country that's really got, two countries that have the acreage to supply most of the world, and that's the United States and Russia. Right. If our two countries agreed no longer to burn fossil fuels and the rest of the world agreed, our two countries could probably sustain a lot of the world's use. And of course, we'd all then be utilizing plants in an annual sustainable way and reclaiming the earth. We'd be growing elephant grass here, and then when that was harvested, we'd be putting in legumes there, we'd be putting in red clover, we'd be putting in cannabis, we would be taking prairie land that we may not want to plant every year, but plant it every third year. We would be reclaiming desert areas by letting it grow, lay fallow, and pull back into the lands. At least that's my vision of what it could be done on an extreme. There's no scientific or agricultural reason. I will make this, of all the agricultures, whether it's Iowa or Texas A&M, I will say to them, there is no other way you guys can come up with a plant that can do all of these things. I'm not saying there aren't other good plants and that we don't need a balance, but there's no other plant that can do it all, make our paint. They're the oil, the paint, the best food, best protein. It kills all weeds because no other plant can compete with it. For the sun, we don't have to put weedicides and herb killers on the plant. We have a wonderful, wonderful plant, and it resists. In fact, the plant grows stronger and better the more ultraviolet. That's why in the indoor lighting systems are all full of ultraviolet. Or you can take very lousy weed. I try to explain this to the director of cannabis in France. You can take lousy weed that's only 0.03% from a smoker's point of view on the plains in France, move it 6,000 feet up a mountain in Southern California, and you got yourself 3, 4, 5% THC, because the THC is the plant's response to ultraviolet. It's its sunscreen, it's its copper tone. So the more the depletion of the ozone, the stronger pot's getting on Earth. I mean, it'll be the last plant growing on Earth. It'll have the last protection. The amoeba will be gone. All the 1 and 2 cell animals will be gone, and hemp will still be growing.
The problem we confront in a capitalist society is that a lot of powerful economic interests would lose if hemp was legalized. The oil industries, the paper industries, the drug industries, different chemical industries, different other manufacturing and production
About $1 trillion. Hemp would be the single largest industry in a world that was by law natural, where the natural cycle was the only cycle. Hemp would be the biggest single business in the world.
So are these groups fighting currently against the normalization, the legalization of marijuana to protect their economic interests in part? Is there any evidence that people like George Bush, for instance, who have chemical interests in chemical companies, have fought marijuana politically?
For these reasons.
Yeah.
Well, I can tell you this, the Partnership for a Drug-Free America is financed by the brewery companies, by the Coors Company, and by the pharmaceutical companies. And they have billions to lose if marijuana is legal. Now, I'm not saying that's definitely the conspiracy. I'm not saying that DuPont's who's going to lose 80% of its pulp paper sulfide process is fighting it. Who knows which way these guys fight? They already bought the politicians. I mean, when I was a kid, I never thought, for instance, that politicians would have ever sold out the ozone layer, the only protection you got against ultraviolet light, would have sold it out because they got children, just like I got children. You know, so they definitely, no matter how much money was offered to them, they're not going to sell out the ozone layer to go from the size of Rhode Island in 1973 to the size of Texas in 1985 to 95% of the size of Texas of Antarctica in 90, and 35% of the size of the Arctic and 95% of the size of the Antarctic. All of that ozone is depleted because our politicians voted with DuPont in 1973 when the moratorium was asked, when the doctors showed that this depletion would go until skin cancer from ultraviolet radiation would be the single leading cause of death by 2020 on Earth. And Alaska and Australia, Alaska is getting a huge increase in skin cancer because of the depletion up there. In Alaska, the males now have the leading cause of death in Australia is skin cancer. Now, this is stuff we've got to stop. We've got to get away from politicians and their red herrings, and this war on drugs is just like this hysteria has to stop because this war on drugs has just taken away our rights. They have now made it treasonable to be for legalization of drugs. During the war on drugs, the bill was passed as a rider on the transportation bill that was passed like 5 days before Congress adjourned for this election. It was signed by Bush. We now have a law that's gone into effect that it becomes treasonous to have this show and to advocate the legalization of any drug. We are in a war on drugs, and during a war, you do not give aid and benefits to the enemy, and the enemy is drugs, and anybody who advocates legal drug is giving aid to them. That is their reasoning, and they expect to take our homes away or to take our properties away, whatever we've accumulated, so that we will take us out of the public fight. That's how you take people out of the public fight. You take their property away. They told us the RICO laws were only meant for the Al Capones, for the biggest gangsters. They would never use it even on the middle gangsters because it would be too delicate of a situation. Now they've got it down to one roach or one list. They can take your house, your property, your car. Not if you kill somebody, not if you're drunk and you run over them, but if you're smoking a joint on the side of in your car, or they can take your car away. But if you got a bottle in your car and you're drunk, they don't take your car away. They just impound it for the night until you can pick it up.
This was partly the result of William Bennett when he was drug czar. They were also taking people's apartments away if they had public housing.
Is that changed?
Well, there still are. I mean, I'm saying this is the policy. But your book has some very interesting facts about George Bush and Dan Quayle, that as soon as Bush retired as head of the CIA, he was made one of the directors by Dan Quayle's father of the Lilly drug company that's infamous for dumping pharmaceuticals in the third world that have been banned in
CIA front.
Possibly a CIA front that were banned in the U.S. And then Bush and Quayle, of course, who represent drug company interests economically, have been fighting tooth and nail the legalization of marijuana and fighting for more extreme criminalization.
I would think that at least it's suspect. The scenario says these guys sit down. We're never going to. They don't even see us as people. They're the real people. They're the real Americans. To me, they're traitors. See, it's traitors to sell out if you sell out my atmosphere or my earth, and you're going to poison the earth, and you're not going to charge people for cleaning up the future cleanup of all the fossil fuel poison that we've put out, then you've created some sort of treason, at least to the earth. But when you keep the natural cycle out of it by law, and the synthetic cycle in it by law, that if I wanted to start a plastic company, I'd get a pat on the back. But if I wanted to start a hemp plastic company, which would be biodegradable, I would go to prison. If I want to start a paper company that makes sense in current green economics, I'll go to prison. Right now, we asked the DEA in Oregon this year, could we grow hemp? We had the acreage, we had the seeds available to us. Could we grow hemp for paper and bring it to an old pulp mill and start it up? They said, absolutely not. It's impossible to grow marijuana for paper. It's illegal. It's the same. I mean, this is the way their mind has compartmentalized it. And you're going to have to get rid of these guys because they've taken away your freedoms. They can take away your funding at school, all for doing a drug. And let's get away from the industrial areas or from the historical future or the future that the earth needs in order to still be here and support human life. We have a medicine here in drugs. There's no dead bodies. There's not a single case of lung cancer. No matter that there's more precancerous lesions, none of those lesions have ever gone out to be cancer because they're not radioactive like tobacco's radioactive, because tobacco by law since 1901 can only use uranium mining trailings for its fertilizer, and the uranium binds with the tobacco in its tars and nicotine so that when you light it up, it becomes plutonium-210 in your body for 21 and a half years. So, you know, and it's illegal by law to tell you that since 1901 or list anything else. When C. Edward Cooper gave up being Surgeon General, the very first statement he made on the very first minute he was no longer Surgeon General of the United States is that the reason you're dying from cigarettes is because of the radioactive uranium mining trailings in all the tobacco farms, because you're not allowed legally to move a tobacco farm from one side of a road to another to rotate it. So the land is dead, and the only way that land will grow and you get price supports is to put uranium mining trailings on and grow it, and the uranium or the radioactivity binds with the tobacco. So when you smoke it, it goes into your lungs like a river running past a sand barge or an island that builds up the debris there, and that's where all of the lung cancer is, on those corners where the radioactivity from tobacco builds up. But not one human being's ever gotten, as far as we know, in Costa Rica, Jamaica, and the United States, we don't know of one human being that's gotten cancer, lung cancer, from just smoking marijuana. Not one. And the Donald Tashkin study at UCLA confirms that of December 1989.
Do other countries ban this uranium trailings in the production of tobacco? I mean, this seems scandalous. We had
United States. Yeah. Well, here's the story in case you want to read it.
Definitely.
By the way, here's the story how one of the reasons they outlawed pot to prove that marijuana was dangerous. Newsweek magazine, January 15th, 1945. The government chose 34 Negroes and 1 white GI for statistical control.
Racist.
I thought that was a good number.
Because we had Bill Drake on this show who talked about how tobacco leaf was saturated with pesticides, how certain chemicals were put into tobacco to keep it smoking.
Oh, yeah.
But he didn't mention this radioactivity.
This is a comprehension article from all these different studies, and it'll tell you that all the radioactivity comes out of your body.
And this was in Reader's Digest, no less.
Pack and a half a day per smoker gets on his skin what would be exposed to 300 chest x-rays.
This is unbelievable.
Okay, and it tells you right here, radioactive footprints. How did radioactive elements get into cigarettes? T.C. So, a former researcher at U.S. Department of Agriculture, tracked the radioactive footprints to the fields where tobacco is grown. For many decades, farmers have fertilized tobacco crops with phosphates rich in uranium. By decay, this uranium generates radium-226, which in turn spawns radon-222, and eventually lead-210 and plutonium-210, and on, and how it picks up. And it only can get out when you ignite the cigarette. But radioactivity does not bind with the cannabis, tars, and THC. That way there is no radioactivity in pot. Tobacco is the single most radioactive substance on earth. Anyway, back to it. You dilate your arteries when you smoke pot. You constrict your arteries when you smoke tobacco. By dilating your arteries, you also lower your body temperature, and then you lower your stress level. By lowering your body temperature, you don't metabolize it, and then you lower your stress level better than anything else we know on earth. We all know that syndrome. Well, by lowering your stress, lowering your body temperature, and dilating your arteries, you live longer than if you do no drugs at all, and you live 8 to 24 years longer if you smoke marijuana instead of using alcohol and tobacco. So you got to be a perfect idiot to follow the government and not smoke marijuana. And these guys are lemmings who made up this law.
And to smoke cigarettes.
To smoke cigarettes, based on this information, you are definitely radioactively insane.
You're committing suicide. It's like you're working in a nuclear radiation plant.
But you know, it's illegal to warn you of it. So everything I see, all these rights, all these laws, are just things that have been taken away from us, freedoms that have been taken away from us. They're knocking my door, open my door, find something and can go in through my house now, take my car away, you fit a profile. This has become a fascist country. When I went through Europe, there wasn't hardly a flag of any country flying. And a lot of my friends that were, some friends there, they said, I hate America. You go there, the McDonald's has got an American flag, the gas station's got the car dealer's got an American flag. You know what we all think in Europe? That's the way the fascists were here. That's Mussolini, that's Hitler, that was Stalin. Flags, 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 flags. Get the people hysterical. We'll put up more flags. Only the good Americans stop at Bob Burns because it's got a flag, you know. And he said, we're good American boys here. And that word, I mean, we've become very nationalistic. And we've got to look back. I mean, we all love this country because we can have this type of dissent. But when this dissent becomes treasonous, And these guys hang flags. They're treasonous. And if I had my way, they would go to prison or at least have to do 6 years of intensive dope smoking before giving them the right to vote again.
Well, you know, there is so much hypocrisy inherent in all of this.
Yeah, it seems to me that way.
And so it seems to me that, I mean, it's got to be abundantly clear. The truth has to come out. So
What about short-term memory loss? Come on, you've forgotten about short-term. You know about short-term memory. Have you ever had short-term memory loss from marijuana? Well, I've had short-term memory misplacements, sir. I didn't really lose it. I was talking and I digressed and I couldn't get back into the file. But if somebody will remind me a moment later, a day later, a week later, a year later, a mid-stride, you can pick it all up. So I don't believe in loss, and it gives you a great long-term memory gain. My mother, who didn't get stoned or high with me until she was 70 years old, I finally got her high in 1973, or 83, and we got high, and my mom, who was 70 years old and did every type of Milltown, Valium, type of down or up, or she probably did Quaaludes, she did everything, and she looked at me, why don't you give up drugs, Jack? You're smoking that marijuana. My mother had a $10,000 medicine cabinet, and I finally got her stoned, and I made her smoke one after the other, just like that girl did with me with Acapulco Gold. And she said, and I found out that my mother was married before my dad. Yeah, I did. And I called up my brother and said, did you know that Mom was married before Dad? How'd you find out? I said, I got her stoned. He said, you got Mom stoned? Don't you know your mother is a very sick lady? You got your mother stoned. I said, I had the best conversation I ever had with my mother. I danced to when we put out an Al Jolson record, and I danced with my mother at this great time. She said, oh, Daddy, and I used to love it. You know, right after I married him, after I divorced this other guy. I said, you were divorced? I didn't know my mom was married. And I was 42 years old when I found that out. So maybe people shouldn't have it. It's too much like a truth serum, you know.
wasn't it looked at as a truth serum?
Oh, yeah, it was. It was. In the 40s, Harry Anslinger was in charge, except they found the problem was that not all the people would tell the truth, and that some of the people would get incredible munchies. And they were giving them hashish oil that had been purified, like what we called honey oil. Yeah. And they were putting it right in the food. It was totally bland. And they're getting these people stoned out of their mind and asking them questions, you know. But they would get all sorts of answers. But they knew they didn't get violent. They just got strange. So Harry Anslinger by that time knew that marijuana no longer caused violence. He thought it caused pacifism. After selling it to Congress to make it criminal because there was hatchet murders and accidents and violence, he sold it 10 years later because the communists would give it to our boys to sap our will to fight. And they passed the law, the exact opposite reasoning 10 years later that they outlawed it in the first place. First for violence, and then because it was too pacifistic. Wow, what a government that can think on its feet like that.
Jack, you were the founder of an organization called Hemp, which means to help end marijuana prohibition. Could you tell us the history of this group, why you founded it, and what you all have been up to?
Well, we've been up doing these colleges and state capitals and cities and wherever people invite us. We're doing about 150 to 200 college and city shows a year. I do Boston at where the men ran through to dump the tea in Boston Harbor in the same exact building. December 15th. I just did a few tour dates in Europe. We're out there teaching this stuff so people can get off of this. They don't know the information. I really do think people are basically totally honest. They just literally don't know. I don't think Bill Bennett's totally honest, but I think most people are basically totally honest. And they just don't know this information. And that's what we founded the group, to teach everything about hemp. Normal was more of a lawyer's and a lobbyist. We were more of an activist to teach the people, to get out in their faces. I don't care whether you want to hear it, you're going to hear it, you're going to hear it, and you're going to hear it. And it doesn't matter what your gut reaction is to me today or to this information. We feel that you're basically honest. And by the time you look it up in your dictionary, encyclopedia, canvas is the Dutch pronunciation of cannabis, and that rag paper was basically made out of hemp, that the early drafts of the Declaration of Independence, the early drafts, were made out of hemp, and that the final one was ordered a month later and put on animal skin, a parchment.
And one of the ways you're transmitting this information is your book here. Is this available in most bookstores? The Emperor Wears No Clothes, the authoritative historical record of the cannabis plant, hemp prohibition, and how marijuana can save the world. Can people get this in their bookstores,
Yeah, I think,
or do they have to write your
They can
organization?
write my organization, but at the Planet K and Nicoa, is it Nicoa? Bookstore here in town carry it. Others are picking it up. In almost every store where the book is, it has become the bestseller.
Really?
Yeah, our sales are incredible. We are an underground publisher. We anticipated a few hundred copies a week. We're up over 1,000. We think over 1,000 copies a week now, steady since about June and growing all the time. So we think we're doing it.
And you're not really organizing like a political lobby. You're more of like the educational
Well, we're
wing.
doing an initiative in California March 1st. The wording of our initiative, and this is why we formed our group basically, is to ask 1,000 people to petition and get 500 signatures each March 1st to March 9th, even though we have till August 1st. The wording is that adults 18 years or older shall not be punished criminally, be denied any right or privilege, be subject to any permit, license requirements, fines, searches, or forfeitures for past or present use of cannabis for industrial, paper fiber fuel, medicinal, asthma, glaucoma, etc., or personal use of cannabis. That marijuana is hereby restored to the available list of medicines in California, and licensed physicians shall not be penalized for prescribing marijuana for medical purposes. That the manufacturer or literature between adults of items intended for the growing, propagating, cultivating, harvesting, storing, analyzing of consumption of cannabis for industrial, medicinal, or personal use shall not be prohibited. That with the passage of this initiative shall be an amnesty and the clearing of all criminal records for all acts which are hereby no longer legal, so everybody will get their TROW, everybody will get a out of jail free that doesn't have violence accepted for all acts that are no longer illegal. And that they'll still be able to make laws against driving under the influence that we've always felt that people drive not better, but a little bit safer, based on the statistics that we have from insurance companies, based on the statistics that we have from thousands of studies that we did both in simulators, in car and driver did actual, and we actually have these studies with us. People drove a little bit safer. They got home better on pot than even those that didn't even do drugs. They just missed their freeway exits more often. But instead of going like this, instead of going, you know, when you're straight and you miss your freeway exit, you go, whoa, and you pull over 3 lanes, you almost kill everybody on the highway. When you're stoned and you miss your freeway exit, you just go, whoa, there it goes. And you get off the next section, oh, New Kentucky Fried Chicken.
Jack, on the back of the book, it says a $10,000 challenge to the world.
Yes.
Can you tell us what that is?
prove
Would you
us
give
wrong.
the challenge to?
Yeah, if all fossil fuels and their derivatives, as well as the deforestation of trees for paper and agriculture, are banned from use in order to save the planet, protect the ozone layer, and reverse the greenhouse effect, then there's only one known renewable natural resource able to provide the overall majority of our paper, textiles, and food, meet all the world's transportation, home, and industrial energy needs, reduce pollution, rebuild the soil, clean the atmosphere, all at the same time. Our old standby that did it all before, cannabis, hemp, marijuana, super mouse.
So the challenge is
For them to come up and say, there's another plant or a system of plants that can make all of the paper, can make all the fuel to run the earth, or claim that hemp can't. And we've been doing this for 2 years at lots of colleges, right into the botanists and horticulturists and to the scientists, and they all agree in theory, including the United States Department of Agriculture, that no other plant can do it. It's just illegal.
illegal.
And you can't use something illegal to save the earth.
But during World War II, it was not only legal, it was considered patriotic to grow marijuana.
But now, with Philippine and East Indian sources of hemp in the hands of the Japanese, and shipment of jute from India curtailed, American hemp must meet the needs of our Army and Navy as well as of our industries. In 1942, patriotic farmers at the government's request planted 36,000 acres of seed hemp, an increase of several thousand %. The goal for 1943 is 50,000 acres of seed hemp. In 1942, 14,000 acres of fiber hemp were harvested in the United States. The goal for 1943 is 300,000 acres. Spinning American hemp into rope, yarn, or twine in the old Kentucky River Mill at Frankfort, Kentucky. All No such plants will presently be turning out products spun from American-grown hemp. Twine of various kinds for tying, winding armatures, and upholsterers' work. Rope for marine rigging and towing, for hay forks, derricks, and heavy-duty tackle. Light-duty fire hose. Thread for shoes for millions of American soldiers. And parachute webbing for our paratroopers. As for the United States Navy, every battleship requires 34,000 feet of rope, and other craft accordingly. So here in the Boston Navy Yard, where cables for frigates were made long ago, crews are now working night and day making cordage for the fleet. Hemp for mooring ships, hemp for tow lines. Hemp for tackle and gear. Hemp for countless naval uses, both on ship and shore. Just as in the days when old Ironside sailed the seas victorious, with her hempen shrouds and hempen sails. Hemp for victory.
I think act as a computer virus to take away the energy. We don't have any dead bodies except at the hands of the police. We've got jails filled with people that in every aspect are totally law-abiding, good citizens, except they chose to smoke a herb with their marijuana, with their tobacco, or instead of their tobacco, instead of their alcohol, they add an herb that is basically benign and even beneficial to their health. And that's what we're out teaching people. And eventually we feel in that pile of information, eventually people will come to see that marijuana is not their enemy, but their friend, and that reefer madness will be over and reefer gladness will begin.
That's the end of this Alternative Views. Frequently hear from viewers who request a list of news publications, which we use on Alternative Views, and also a reading list for U.S. power structure in the mass media. If you would like to have these, send a stamped, self-addressed envelope to the Alternative Information Network, P.O. Box 7279, Austin, Texas 78713. You must send a self-addressed stamped envelope. We also can give you information on how to get some publications by former CIA officer John Stockwell. We'd like to thank our crew for the production. Kevin L. West, our audio man, and Eric Eubank was on the camera. Alternative Views is a presentation of the Alternative Information Network, P.O. Box 7279, Austin, Texas 78713. Goodbye.